projects at $150,000. That's ongoing, unlike the other statutory filings. Uses of revenue, Valerie talked about this, and I'm sure it's something you're already familiar with. 2% staff development set aside, suspended for 2 years, so it's just the same process we had the last 2 years. The maintenance of effort requirement for licensed support staff was eliminated, along with the requirement to reserve $3 per pupil of the Safe Schools levy for licensed school support staff.
How does that affect you immediately?
I think it would be effective for fiscal year 12. I have to go back and double check the effective date in the bill.
Yeah, 11 to 12, I read it.
Yeah, 11, 12, okay. Uses of operating capital revenue were expanded to clarify that you can use the money for leasing vehicles and that the costs directly associated with closing the school facility, including moving the storage costs, can be used for operating capital. It clarifies that cooperatives are required to allocate compensatory revenue to the school site generating revenue, the same way the school districts do if there's more than one site at a co-op, like 287 or something like that. Amended the definition of non-public, for the non-public pupil aid statute to include electronic books in the definition of textbooks for purposes of non-public pupil aid. There's no more money added to that, it just lets them spend the money on something different. Fund transfers, there was a provision enacted that for 2012 and 2013 only, a school district may transfer money from one fund or account to another if the following conditions are met. First, the transfer must not increase state obligations or increase local property taxes. So, for example, you couldn't transfer money out of health and safety and then say you want to levy more for health and safety, as an example. Cost-driven programs would not be allowable. In general, debt service transfers would not be allowable because that would reduce the state's ability to do a debt service excess reduction to the debt levy.
Can you, wait a second, can you explain that? Because I don't get that. I don't see why we can't transfer out of debt service. I didn't see anything in the law that said anything about it either.
Well, we need to work on the details of this, but in general, what happens with debt service is that you're levying 105% of what you need every year.
Yeah.
Over time, you build up a surplus fund balance. And there's a reduction to your debt levy to offset that amount, that excess amount. If you basically take that excess amount and you transfer it to the general fund, then we're not making the levy reduction in the debt service fund, which means your debt service levy is higher than it would have been if we had that passed. That's kind of the logic.
So what's left?
Yeah. Oh, you could take operating capital money. We got that $51 transfer. Well, you can transfer any money you want out of operating capital.
It's really the reserves where the flexibility is.
Yep. Staff development. You know, we haven't been transferring new money in, but you might have some old money that you want to take out of staff development. We're working on a list, and we'll come up with something more detailed. We just haven't had time to think through it all yet. But part of the process is, if you want to make these transfers during 12 and 13, the school board has to adopt a resolution identifying the amount of the transfer and stating that it will not diminish instructional opportunities of the students. And you have to send that to the department. The department has to approve it, but the department is under a tight leash in terms of we can't just say no for any reason. We can only say no if, in the department's view, it will result in an increase in property taxes, which they do. Length of the school year. For many years, we've had a requirement that you have to have the same number of days you had in 1997. That's repealed. Instead, you have to have 425 hours for kindergarten, 935 hours for grades 1 to 6, and 1,020 hours for grades 7 to 12. It's more of a uniform standard across the state. It's equivalent to 170 days at 2.5 hours for kindergarten, 5.5 for grades 1 to 6, and 6 hours for 7 to 12. But it's up to you. If you have a 6.5-hour day, you can have fewer days. You figure out what the number of hours is, so you have more flexibility than you used to have. One clarification that was provided is you still cannot go to a 4-day week unless you go through approval from the commissioner for flexible learning year plans. Concurrent enrollment in PSCO. There was a change made that allows a 9th or 10th grade student to enroll in college in the if, after all of the 11th and 12th graders have signed up, you still need more students in order to make the class a go. So it's a kind of a narrow participation in post-secondary programs for 9th and 10th. It's not open, wide open. The students can't go into any PSEO program they want. It's only college and schools, and only if you need more students to fill up a class. There's also a requirement that school districts provide information on PSEO to 8th and 9th graders, and limits the number of years if a student participates in these college and the schools classes. In 9th and 10th grades, they're limited to 4 years if they start in 9th grade and 3 years if they start in 10th. We're just kind of expanding that out to current requirements. Literacy Incentive Aid, big new program. First time the state is allocating a lot of money based on student performance. So, in terms of proficiency, providing funding for $85 times the school's enrollment on October 1st of the prior year, times the percent of third graders meeting or exceeding proficiency on the third grade MCAs, averaged across the previous 3 test administrations. So our interpretation of that is we look at the test results from 2010, 2011, and 2012, and that determines the amount of money you get in 2013. Same thing with growth aid. So growth aid is based on $85 times the school's enrollment on October 1st of the prior year, times the percent of 4th graders making medium or high growth on the department growth model on reading. In 2013 only, the aid is capped at $48 million. Bottom line is that's the result of the runs that were done by the legislature using older data, but in the event that there's a dramatic increase in student performance in grade 3 between now and 2012, that just caps out the money so that there won't be a huge increase in the aid. But we aren't expecting it'll be prorated unless there's a huge increase in test scores.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't understand more. The word schools enrollment on this thing isn't very clear in the law, so it would be better if you could just pick a grade or a grade level or something. So how is that schools enrollment thing going to be?
It'd be a lot cleaner if they picked a grade span. You know?
Yeah.
But the way this works, you actually get more money if you have, if you have a K-8 elementary as opposed to a K-5 elementary, you get funded for 3 more grades.
Yeah.
So it's an unintended consequence that I wouldn't be surprised to see cleaned up down the road. But for now, let's just give you an example. So on the average in 2010, the last year we have data for, 80% of the third graders were proficient, and 75% of the 4th graders were making medium or high growth. So if we had a school that met that kind of average criteria, and let's say that they were enrolling 400 students in that school, we would take the proficiency aid would be $85 times 400, and that could be enrollment in K through 8, or it could be enrollment in K through 5, times 80%, $27,000. Growth aid, same thing. So that's just an example of how that calculation would work. So in this particular example, it comes to $132 per kid enrolled at the school. And I'm assuming what we'll be using is the MARS definitions of a school. So if you're a small rural school, we're dividing it between elementary and high school. That's how we would. It's the same school you're reporting for MARS purposes. So bottom line is that if you have a grade 3-4 only school, you get a lot less money. I mean, if it has that, but you get a lot less money than if it was K's.
Are you going to attempt to put this in the what is column?
No, because it's not part of general ed. But what we are doing, we're getting a file from the legislature that shows the details of what they used in their assumptions, so that should be available fairly soon.
Tom, are the funds going to have to be reserved and spent at that school?
No. Let me go through this next slide. I think that'll answer your question. So first of all, this includes both school districts and charter schools. Only those schools that enroll kids in 3rd or 4th grade are going to generate any money, and only if they have test results the prior year. So if you have a brand new charter school, they don't get any money because they didn't use it. We're assuming if you're using the average over the last 3 years, if you had like a school that just opened last year, we just used 1 year of data. If you had a school that opened 2 years ago, we used 2 years of data, etc. But you have to have been open the prior year. You can't qualify for any money. Schools with a broader grade span generate more money given a certain set of test results than schools with a narrower grade span. As I said, probably an unintended consequence that might be adjusted down the road. And while the aid is generated using school-level data, there's no requirement for funds to be spent at the school generating the revenue. And there's no requirement to spend it for elementary reading either. So it's just additional money in the district general fund that can be used at the discretion of the district. But certainly it provides an incentive to focus on reading at the elementary in order to get more money. I think that's kind of part of the intent. Okay, integration aid. This was maybe the most contentious part of the negotiations with the governor and the legislature at the end of the session here. The compromise that was reached was that the current integration funding formula remains for fiscal 12 and fiscal 13. Districts will still be required to submit budgets for approval to the department, so there's no change in any of the procedures for the next 2 years. The current integration rule remains in effect. That had been repealed in the legislative bill, but that came back as part of the agreement. So school districts still have an obligation to follow the desegregation rule as it currently exists. The integration interdistrict transportation funding remains in place, and it's part of the base budget 2014 and 2015. Magnet school grants are eliminated beginning in 2012. And the school district levy limits for pay 13 will include an amount equal to the district's certified integration levy for pay 12. So this is probably not a good year to under levy on your integration levy. The base budget for fiscal 14 that's being carried in the legislative tracking includes enough money to cover the final payment for fiscal 13. It also includes money to cover the 31% of the fiscal year 14 integration aid that cities of the first class get paid on July 15th, and it gets recognized in the previous year. There was a kind of a reverse shift in recognition for cities of the first class that took effect a number of years ago. So the bottom line is there's enough money there to make people whole on their fiscal 13 budget. And there's also enough money set aside in the base to cover a 60-40 payment schedule in 2014 and 2015 using the existing integration formula. So if the legislature, if the task force meets and they decide everything's great, there's enough money there to maintain the funding at the level that it's at. Not that they'll do that, but there's enough money there to cover. Then we have this integration revenue replacement advisory task force. Directs the commissioner to convene a 12-member group to develop recommendations for repurposing integration revenue to create and sustain opportunities for students to achieve improved educational outcomes. So it's more of a focus on improving achievement and less mention of integrating schools. 6 members appointed by the commissioner, 6 members appointed by the legislature. So it's supposed to be a balance between the administration and the legislature in terms of the task force. Requires the task force to consider how to effectively narrow and close achievement gaps and foster students' academic achievement. So it's giving you a hint that there's still an interest in closing the achievement gap, and presumably there would be some targeting of this money to school districts that have higher concentrations of minority students or low-income students in order to close achievement gaps. So at least the intent is that there not simply be this money go out of the general formula to everybody. The task force report is due February 15th to the legislature, recommending how best to allocate funds previously allocated in order to achieve improved outcomes for students. There was language added that specifies that the funding allocation should ensure stability for districts between the current program and the new program. Again, this is just advice to the committee, and then the committee only makes advice to the legislature. Ultimately, it's up to the legislature to decide how this money is going to be redirected. The fact that they have a February 15th, 2012 date suggests to me that the legislature is going to try to pass something in 2012 so that there's a heads up as far as what the formula might be.